Hi, and welcome to Birth Words. This is episode number 55. Today we're going to be talking about using empowering language throughout pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period.
Welcome to Birth Words. Words are powerful. What are you doing with yours? In this podcast, birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sara invites you to be intentional, reflective, and empowering with your language as we come together to honor those who give birth. The work of Birth Words is to elevate the language surrounding pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
Welcome to today's episode. Thank you for joining me. Like I said a couple of weeks ago, as we enter year 2 of the podcast, I'm going to a bi-weekly schedule. So every other week, I'll be releasing a new episode. But if you are craving some birth words and it's a Monday and there's no new episode, go back and listen. There's a library of 54 episodes for you to choose from. And I'd love to hear what you think. Send me messages for ideas of what you would like to hear that I haven't talked about yet. And let's keep this going. I've got some exciting guests coming up and I'll continue doing solo episodes. So that's the future of the Birth Words podcast. Thanks for sticking with me. Another announcement that I want to make, I've been announcing this a lot on social media, but I don't think I've mentioned it on the podcast yet, and that is that the month of July, which we're closing up now, entering the last week of July, I have been donating 50% of all proceeds, any money that has been paid towards any Birth Words product, class, whatever. 50% of it I've donated directly to the Black Mamas Matter Alliance. This is a cause that I feel really passionate about. There are really terrible disparities between races of maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates. And Black Mamas Matter is working to center Black birth workers to serve those populations that they are most in touch with and know the needs of, and to lift the birth experience for those people that they serve. So I feel like this is a really important mission that I want to totally be behind, and I'm putting my dollars, your dollars, behind it when you're making any purchases of any product on Birth Words this month. So if you are buying the introductory course, if you are pre-registering for the in-depth birth workers course online, if you register for the live workshop for birth workers coming up in September, if you buy affirmation cards, anything that you see on the site that you pay money for, half of the money you pay will go right to Black Mamas Matter. So like I said, July's closing, so that's going to be coming to an end soon. I am so grateful that with your dollars, I've been able to give more. You've been able to give to this important work, so keep it coming. Now let's talk about this week's topic, empowering language. This is a 3-part series. This is the 3rd episode in a 3-part series that's been going for a while, since I alternate between solo episodes and interviews. So way back on June 15th, I did episode number 51, where I talked about reflective speech. And then episode number 53, I talked about intentional speech on June 29th. And this is the 3rd part of that series, talking about empowering speech. The mission of Birth Words is to invite those giving birth and those supporting them to be reflective, intentional, and empowering with our speech. So that's what this series is walking us through. So let's think about empowering words. The little tagline on the Birth Words website says, "The right words can lift the birth giver from passive patient to life-giving agent. Choose your words to frame a positive perinatal experience." I think this is so important. It's so common in many environments that a birth giver is treated as a passive patient, a passive recipient of care in the hospital, lying in bed, accepting the decisions of doctors and nurses, rather than being a life-giving agent, making decisions for themselves and truly feeling the power that comes when we bring forth new life. It's the most powerful work that I can think of. So it's so critical that we use language that reflects and invites that sort of empowering experience. So for this episode, I did a little Google search of birth, childbirth, and I just found what comes up as kind of a reflection of how many people, many organizations in our society think about and talk about and write about birth. So I have 3 little blurbs that we're going to look at and talk through the language that's used and think about how we could be more empowering than we sometimes are. The first comes from Medline Plus, and it's their article about childbirth. And it starts with a summary, and I am quoting this, and I will give the link in the show notes so that you can read it for yourself if you so desire. So it says, when you are ready to have your baby, you'll go through labor. Labor is the process of giving birth. Signs that you might be going into labor include contractions that are regular, then start to come closer, leaking fluid or bleeding from the vagina, low, dull backache, abdominal cramps. Call your health provider if you have any of these signs, even if it is before your due date. Preterm labor can start before 37 completed weeks of pregnancy. Labor happens in 3 stages. That goes on and describes the 3 stages of labor. And then a little while later, it says, mothers and babies are monitored closely during labor. Most women are able to have a baby through normal vaginal delivery. If there are complications, the baby may need to be delivered surgically by a cesarean section. So, interesting. A few things stood out to me when I read this summary. The first one made me think back to the episode we did earlier about metaphor. How we talk about labor is almost like a car or something that we get into, and that was very clear at the beginning of this paragraph. It says, when you're ready to have your baby, you'll go through labor. Labor is the process of giving birth. Signs that you might be going into labor include. Now, this is totally typical language. I'm not picking apart Medline Plus for their language because it's something that we all say. You go through labor. You might be going into labor. But I want to just pause and reflect how this emphasizes the process of labor really being the agent rather than the person giving birth. And so I invite you to consider other ways that you might say going through labor or going into labor in ways that center you or your client, if you are a birth professional, as the agent in that act. How can we talk about labor more as if it's something that we're doing and not something that's happening to us? And this sort of language happens again later on when it says labor happens in 3 stages, that labor is this thing that's happening and we're kind of along for the astonished ride. I think that speaking about it in this way invites us to experience it in this way. And many people do experience labor and birth in a sort of swept away, it happened to you sort of way. But I think that as we write and speak and prepare for labor and birth in a more empowering way, that we can experience it as a powerful thing that we're doing rather than something that's happening to us. All right, and then the last little paragraph, I skipped the description of the 3 phases of labor, and then we skip down to where it says, most women are able to have a baby through normal vaginal delivery. So it's interesting to me that it says most women are able to have a baby through normal vaginal delivery. It's as if we're separating what we're doing when we give birth from the mechanism, the process by which it happens, which I think disempowers the birth giver during that process. If it says most women are able to have a baby, okay, it's acknowledging that you're having a baby, but then it says through normal vaginal delivery, as if it's this process, again, that you go through, that acts upon you as you bring a baby into the world. Interesting. Okay, let's be reflective, intentional, and empowering as we talk about labor and birth. Next, I have an article from WebMD. Again, Googled childbirth. This came up and it's about vaginal delivery. And I'll just read it and then we'll think about what's going on here with the language. Vaginal delivery is the most common and safest type of childbirth. When necessary in certain circumstances, forceps, instruments resembling large spoons, may be used to cup your baby's head and help guide the baby through the birth canal. Vacuum delivery is another way to assist delivery and is similar to forceps delivery. In vacuum delivery, a plastic cup is applied to the baby's head by suction, and the healthcare provider gently pulls the baby from the birth canal. Vaginal delivery may not always be possible. Cesarean delivery, C-section, may be necessary for the safety of you and your baby, especially if one of these complications is present. Your baby's not in the head-down position. Your baby is too large to pass through the pelvis, or your baby is in distress. Okay, whoa! Let's just rewind and take a little bit of a look at that little excerpt from WebMD about vaginal delivery. That's the topic. Delivery methods, vaginal delivery. First of all, for some thoughts about the word deliver and delivery in relation to childbirth, you can listen to episode number 24, but we'll focus on other parts of this text for now. I find it so interesting that we talk for one sentence sort of very vaguely about vaginal delivery is the most common and safest type of childbirth, and then jump right into interventions that may be, quote, necessary in certain circumstances. And then talks about forceps and vacuum delivery, and it talks about these as ways to assist delivery. And it says that with the vacuum specifically, the healthcare provider gently pulls the baby from the birth canal. So much of this first paragraph is focused on how a doctor or other care provider can step in and intervene, as it says, as necessary in certain circumstances. But it totally skips over A, the fact that in most circumstances these are not needed, B, the factors that could be contributing to making it, quote, necessary position, for instance, of giving birth. And it just spends so much time and energy describing the processes by which a baby can be extracted from the mother's vagina, rather than talking about the process and what is typical and how a birth giver can typically be the one to do the act of giving birth without these interventions. All right, and then the next paragraph it talks about, in this little excerpt that's supposed to be about vaginal delivery, the second paragraph after it talks about these births with forceps and vacuums, as if they're totally the norm, that a birth giver would need that kind of assistance rather than being able to birth the child by themselves. Then it says, in the second paragraph, in the section on the website that's about vaginal delivery, oh, hey, here's some more about C-sections. And of course, it says it may be necessary for the safety of you and your baby. And you use that word safety, and people turn their heads and they listen and they say, I want my baby to be safe. I want to be safe. And then outlines baby in a head down position, too large to pass through the pelvis or being in distress. And of course, doesn't go into all of the factors that go along with each of these things. Like, okay, if baby's not in a head down position, there absolutely are care providers who attend breech deliveries, and breech babies can be born safely if your care provider is trained in breech birth. There are also tons of different ways to encourage a breech baby to flip head down before it is born, which of course that doesn't go into, it just simply glosses over it. Baby being too large to pass through the pelvis. This is typically misdiagnosed and There are lots of things, again, like not lying flat on our backs, being in a more upright position where your pelvic diameter increases significantly, that can make a really huge difference. And also waiting for labor to begin on its own whenever possible so that your joints and your ligaments and your muscles are ready to stretch and make space for baby. On your baby being in distress, which absolutely nobody wants their baby to be in distress. And it can be a cause for cesarean. Of course, it doesn't go into some of the reasons that could be caused. And there are interventions that certainly could be part of leading towards that. Overall, reading this excerpt from WebMD, I just get the feeling it's from WebMD, right? That it's focusing on what a healthcare provider does during birth and not what a birth giver does during birth. So let's talk about birth as if it's something that we do, not as if it's something that a doctor does to us or even assists us with or evaluates whether or not we're competent for. Let's talk about birth as if it's a process that we prepare our bodies, our minds, and our spirits for, and we make informed, educated, intuitive decisions about the place we want to give birth, the positions we want to labor in, the positions we want to birth in. And then we, in our power, bring forth life. Let's talk about birth like that. All right, the third web-based information about childbirth that I wanted to go into is a YouTube video. It's called This Is Your Childbirth in 2 Minutes by Glamour, and Glamour has a lot of This Is Your Blank in 2 minutes videos, so it's going along with that genre. So since this is a video, and since this is birth words, of course, we're going to be talking about language in the video, but we're also going to be talking about other modes of communication. So this is a video. It shows a video of a woman, supposedly in labor. There's music in the background. There's different illustrations later. And so those all play into how this video is communicating its message. It's a multimodal method of communication. And so that you can imagine how this video is, it doesn't have any spoken words. It has some music playing in the background, kind of like dingy, kind of upbeat music, and then it has a woman that is kind of acting out, going through the various parts of labor. And while it shows her physical and emotional reactions, her facial expressions, it has captions, not on the bottom, but on the side of the screen, so they're pretty prominent, that kind of narrate the process. So you're reading this narration while you watch her, quote, going through labor. So, first of all, we see this woman at the beginning of the video sitting on a couch, and the narrated captions that we read talk about when labor might start and what it might feel like. And you watch this woman first happy and then very surprised and overcome very suddenly, totally in shock when she feels a contraction. And as the video proceeds, she becomes totally anguished in her facial expressions until she's holding her baby at the end. So the captions talk about all the things that are going to happen to you. You're going to lose your mucus plug. You're going to start dilating. You're going to feel contractions. And it gives suggestions of what to do. So it says, like in the early labor section, it says, good time to relax. Best to distract yourself from the pain with, and it gives some suggestions. And then it says, later, as contractions get more intense, good idea to keep time of your contractions. And then as they become 5 minutes apart, it says, good time to go to the hospital. And then we see the woman lying in bed as soon as she arrives at the hospital, just flat on her back. She does turn to the side as well, lies on her side for a bit when she's totally in anguish, because who wants to labor lying flat on their back? It is the most comfortable position for labor. Absolutely. I could suggest a few other positions she could try, but she doesn't. It says, remember to focus on your breathing. It talks about you may choose to get an epidural and gives a really scary looking, because it's so quick and animated, portrayal of getting an epidural. It says push in all capital letters with an exclamation mark. It seems like it's really the first time that this video has directed you to do much of anything. Of course, it says keep track of your contractions, go to the hospital, focus on your breathing. But doesn't talk a lot about what you're really doing during labor. Then, once we say push, it shifts. Rather than watching this woman lying flat on her back, looking for all intents and purposes as a passive recipient of care rather than an active life-giving agent, the shot in the movie changes to a paper cutout that is depicting a woman's vulva in the center of the screen and then kind of her legs on either side. And you watch as a baby doll emerges while it talks about the process of giving birth. And then afterwards, baby goes and cuddles with mom and the movie wraps up. So this was a really, really interesting one. It's tricky because it falls into this genre that Glamour makes these videos called Your Blank in 2 Minutes. So obviously it's glossing over a lot of details, and it has this music that really just seems like flippant and kind of, like I said before, dingy or pingy. It certainly doesn't fit how I would want to depict my own process of giving birth. But it's the music that goes along with any of these videos that they do this way. That was my first concern. Then my next concern with this video, and it being disempowering rather than empowering, is that this woman never stands up or walks or moves. Like, she's sitting on a couch. Labor starts happening to her, right? Like, it's very apparent that that's how it's being depicted. She looks so shocked and surprised that something's happening to her, and responds by, okay, well, I'll relax and try to ignore it. A bowl of popcorn flies from the edge of the screen and lands in her lap, and she sits back and eats popcorn and lets this labor thing happen to her. And then as it progresses more, she gets progressively alarmed at what's going on. And like I said in my summary of this video, when she gets to the hospital, she's lying flat on her back. Just, oh, no, it's the worst way to labor. But looking so incredibly disempowered, lying flat on your back. I cannot think of a less empowering physical posture to be in. And the fact that many, many, many people have given birth that way is just really heart-wrenching. In that position of disempowerment. All right, then I sort of mentioned that when it says in all caps push, it's like the first thing that it's really directing somebody to do. And I think that many people experience labor that way as well. That it's something that happens to them until the doctor comes along and says, okay, it's time to push. And then they're like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. But by then they're so tuned out with what's going on with their body that it's really difficult to regain your power in such a moment like that. It says here your doctor might perform an episiotomy, as if your doctor is the one acting, making the decisions about whether that's preferred. Doesn't go into any detail about why that would be done or whether you have a choice in the matter, which is kind of tragic. But most tragic of all, I feel like, is this depiction of, we're seeing this woman lying flat on her back in bed, looking so disempowered, and then the shot changes to show this paper cutout of a woman's vulva and legs on either side of it. And she's so objectified in this moment that the entire process of birth is represented by her spread open legs and a baby emerging. And there's no whole person in this image. And yes, we're showing the process of a baby emerging, but wow, it's just felt so impersonal and disempowering for that moment of bringing life into the world to be this objective body part, totally disconnected from the person doing the work of bringing forth life. All right. So now you can tell that after we've talked about these 2 articles and this video, that I would not recommend any of them as sources to turn to as you prepare for birth, or to recommend clients to if you are a birth professional. There are so many that are great. I feel like I should pause and just mention a few. One of my favorite books that I have quoted before, Ina May Gaskin's Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, talks about birth as an empowering process in which the birth giver is actively involved, is the central agent, and that phrase central agent comes from Ina May. And there are lots of beautiful stories about birth happening in that beautiful way. I also love Sara Buckley's Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering. It talks about the decisions that we make as we go through the process of pregnancy and birth and postpartum, and how this is a decision-making process, not something that happens to us, right? Similarly, Hensi Goer's The Thinking Woman's Guide to a Better Birth and Birthing from Within talks a lot about the internal work we do in addition to the external work as we bring forth life. So many good resources. Don't turn to Medline or WebMD or Your Childbirth in 2 Minutes. Other episodes from this podcast, we've also touched on using empowering language. So here are a few. Back in episode 48, we talked about hope and choice. We talked about using empowering language as a birth mom, making that difficult decision to choose adoption for your baby, and how it's so important to use empowering language that frames that as a hopeful choice rather than as a surrender. In episode 46, Dr. Michelle Coates talked about caring for the whole person during pregnancy. She is a chiropractor who specializes in prenatal chiropractic care. And she talked about how she sees her clients as whole people and cares for their emotional and physical needs through this journey of pregnancy and birth. So very different, right, from the description of childbirth that's shown in the paper cutout graphic of the vulva that is objectifying the process of giving birth to just focusing on one single body part. Instead, Dr. Michelle talks about the whole person process of pregnancy and birth. Episode 45, we talked about metaphors and how we talk about birth and some of these metaphors that might not be super empowering. Episodes 43 and 41, we talked about using agentive language, centering yourself as the agent, especially in the time of COVID-19, this pandemic that has just swept across our world and continues to. I was going to list all of the episodes where we touched on using empowering language, but once I went through the last 15 and had already mentioned half of them, I realized that would make this episode a lot longer than it needs to be. So I invite you to go back and listen with this lens. Think about empowering language as you listen to the previous episodes, and let me know what you think, what sort of insights come as you do that exercise. So as we close, I have an invitation for you. Whether you are preparing to give birth or supporting those who are, let's be empowering with our words. Let's choose words that honor individuality, choice, power, and the wonder of giving life.
If you're interested in sharing your ideas or experiences on the podcast, go to birthwords.com. If you're liking what you hear, please leave a review on your podcast app. For more resources about language for a better birth, subscribe to the monthly newsletter at birthwords.com and follow Birthwords on Instagram and Facebook.